Greetings, dear friends. Today we invite you to journey into the poignant memories of a Finnish soldier, whose diary provides a powerful insight into the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. Written amid the bitter cold and fierce battles against the Soviet invasion, this diary was discovered among the remnants of a small unit that fought courageously for their homeland. Chapter 1. The silence before the storm. The forest lay still beneath the weight of snow, each tree coated in heavy, unbroken white. Branches hung low, burdened and brittle, ready to snap under the slightest touch. It was the kind of silence I never heard in Kokkola, the kind that pressed on your ears and chilled your bones. Nothing moved in this deep cold, no birds, no animals, not even the wind. Just the snow that fell constantly, whispering down around us, deadening every sound and softening the edges of everything it touched. Out here, the snow was our cloak and our curse. Our unit had arrived only days earlier, but the isolation made it feel like weeks. We huddled in small groups, hiding in makeshift dugouts and narrow trenches carved into the frozen earth. The trees closed in around us, their dark forms casting thin shadows in the pale, overcast light. The snow had piled so high and so densely that you couldn't tell where the land ended and the sky began. It was all one vast, blank canvas, and we were just scratches in the white. It struck me how easy it would be to disappear here, for the earth to swallow us whole, leaving nothing but silence. I took a deep breath, and the cold air burned as it filled my lungs, each breath biting harder than the last. We'd wrapped ourselves in every layer we could find, patched and repatched wool and fur. But still, the cold crept in like an unwelcome guest. It slipped beneath our collars, seeped through the soles of our boots, and settled in our bones. You could never escape it. Sometimes I wondered if it would kill us before the Soviets even reached us. Our officer, a wiry man named Koskinen, who had a permanent squint from years of squaring off with the sun on fishing boats, had gathered us for a briefing the night before. His voice had been low, steady, and so quiet that we all leaned in close, breath misting in front of us. "They're coming soon," he'd said, eyes darting to the edges of the forest. "We don't know when, but they'll come. The Soviets won't stay in their barracks much longer." That night, as I lay beneath layers of threadbare blankets, I thought about what he'd said. For weeks, the Soviets had been gathering just beyond our borders, a slow and ominous swell of soldiers in steel. Tanks, planes, men by the thousands all marching toward this quiet, snow-blanketed land that they'd decided to conquer. It felt strange to imagine them waiting out there, so close, in their iron shells and uniforms, just as cold as we were. I imagined them breathing the same frozen air, looking at the same white sky. Somewhere in the woods, a twig snapped, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. My hand went instinctively to my rifle. I glanced at Juho, a lanky man from the south who was crouched beside me, rubbing his hands together to keep warm. He looked at me and raised an eyebrow. We waited, listening, our breaths held tight in our chests. But there was nothing, just the slow drip of melting snow from a branch overhead. After a while, Juho exhaled, a long plume of steam curling from his mouth. He gave a small, nervous chuckle. "It's strange, isn't it?" he whispered. "How quiet it is. Like even the world is waiting." I nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within me. There was something unnatural about the silence, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Every snap, every crunch, every breath sounded like a warning. The stillness wasn't peace, it was the anticipation of something inevitable, a storm gathering on the horizon, waiting to break. In the days since we'd arrived, we'd started calling this place the White Waiting Room. It felt like limbo, a place where we waited for the world to end or for ourselves to become part of it, one way or another. It wasn't the idea of death that got to me, it was the waiting. This agonizing suspension, where time stretched and twisted and left you with nothing but your own thoughts. And in the silence, those thoughts grew louder. I thought about Kokkola often. I could picture it so clearly, the narrow streets lined with wooden houses, the smell of salt and seaweed in the air. I remembered the market square where I'd meet friends, the laughter and noise that filled the air. The warmth of my mother's kitchen, the smell of rye bread baking in the oven. It felt like another life, like something I'd dreamed but never lived. Out here in this frozen purgatory, Kokkola might as well have been a million miles away. A thin layer of frost had formed on the edge of my rifle, and I ran my thumb over it, watching as it melted beneath the warmth of my skin. It felt strange to think of my rifle as warm. It had become almost an extension of myself, something familiar and reliable in a world where little else was. I wondered if the Soviets felt the same about their weapons, if they too found comfort in the cold steel that had become a lifeline. The daylight was fading, and the forest was slipping into that gray-blue darkness that came just before night. The silence seemed to deepen with the twilight, pressing down heavier than before. Somewhere in the distance I thought I heard the faint echo of engines, the rumble of machines, but it was so far away, so muted, that I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my imagination. I glanced over at Juho, who had stopped rubbing his hands and was staring into the trees. He must have heard it too. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. They were coming. The Soviets were coming, a relentless tide of iron and men, and we were all that stood in their way. The silence, it seemed, was only the calm before the storm. Chapter 2. First Contact. Dawn came in a slow, gray crawl, stretching out across the endless snow as though the light itself was reluctant to touch this frozen land. The forest looked like a world lost in time, trees sagging under their icy coats, shadows twisting long and dark on the ground. I felt the cold settle deeper into my bones as I crouched in the snow, my rifle gripped tight in my hands, eyes scanning the trees. We were all spread out in silence, each of us tucked behind a trunk or huddled low among the roots, the only movement the slow exhalation of our breaths clouding the air. Then came a sound, a faint crunch of snow, a slight rustling in the trees. Juho caught my eye from a few paces away, his face pale and tense, lips pressed into a thin line. The Soviets were coming. The morning's silence broke in the snap of a twig somewhere in the shadows. I raised my rifle, squinting against the glare of light reflecting off the snow, straining to see the first sign of movement. They moved slowly, cautiously. First, a lone figure emerged from behind a thick oak, scanning the area with dark eyes. The soldier wore a thick brown overcoat, its shoulders lined with frost, and in his gloved hands, he held a rifle as he stepped carefully through the drifts. Behind him, more figures appeared, each moving with the same cautious, deliberate pace, as if they, too, felt the weight of the silence pressing down on them. Their breaths floated like ghosts in the frigid air, and I could see the subtle tension in the way they moved, the nerves, the uncertainty, the fear. Juho's fingers tapped lightly on his rifle, his eyes meeting mine as he nodded. He had a faint smirk, the kind that was more habit than humor, a flicker of resolve that bolstered me as much as it did him. Slowly, silently, I raised my rifle, my hands steady despite the bitter cold that gnawed at my fingers. I let out a long, measured breath, focusing on the steady beat of my heart as I aimed down the sight. My target, a Soviet soldier trudging forward with a weary, half-frozen expression, came into view. I felt my finger curl around the trigger, and for one taut second, everything else fell away, the cold, the fear, the hunger. I exhaled, pulling the trigger, and the shot rang out, splitting the silence like a knife through thin glass. The crack of gunfire echoed through the forest, sending birds scattering into the pale sky, and in that instant, the world erupted. The Soviet soldier fell, clutching his chest, eyes wide with shock as he crumpled into the snow. His comrades whipped around, their faces frozen in horror, but only for a moment. Within seconds, they sprang into action, dropping low and taking cover, their own rifles aimed blindly into the forest, firing back in short bursts. Snow sprayed up in small explosions around us as bullets hit the trees, sending splinters and chunks of bark flying through the air. I ducked, pressing myself against the thick trunk of the tree, feeling the bark rough and cold against my cheek. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, mixing with the crisp bite of winter air. Juho was firing steadily beside me, his face a grim mask of concentration as he sighted down his rifle. Each shot he fired was deliberate, each movement calculated, a dance with death carried out in perfect silence. Around us, our men emerged from the shadows, rifles raised, moving with the practiced ease of hunters who had grown up tracking game in these very woods. We didn't need words, every movement was instinct, every step a calculation, every breath in rhythm with the others around us. The snow and silence were our allies here. The Soviet soldiers, encumbered by the unfamiliar terrain and burdened with heavy packs, moved clumsily, crashing through the undergrowth like intruders in a place they didn't belong. They were easy targets, their shapes broad and visible against the stark white. I peered out from behind my cover, watching as one Soviet soldier crouched low behind a fallen log, his rifle aimed frantically at every sound, every movement. His face was twisted in concentration, brow furrowed as he scanned the trees, eyes wide with fear. He couldn't have been much older than me, perhaps younger, a boy from another country, another life. A momentary pang struck me, a small shard of something like pity, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. This was war. Either he would kill me, or I would kill him. My next shot cracked through the morning air, and he dropped, disappearing into the snow like a dark smudge wiped clean from a page. More gunfire erupted as his comrades scrambled to regroup, voices shouting in Russian, their tones urgent and sharp. I couldn't understand the words, but the desperation was clear. They were beginning to realize they were surrounded, outmatched in these dense, ghostly woods. Koskinen, our officer, signaled to move forward, his hand a quick motion in the air. One by one we advanced, moving from tree to tree, keeping low, our footsteps as silent as shadows on the snow. Every step brought us closer to the Soviet soldiers, who were firing wildly now, their shots ricocheting off trunks, the bullets thudding harmlessly into the drifts around us. We had the advantage here. This was our land, our forest, and every tree, every shadow was an ally. In the distance, a Soviet machine gunner found his mark, a single rattle of bullets sweeping through the trees, and I heard the dull thud of one of our men falling to the ground. My heart clenched, but I forced myself to keep moving, pressing forward, feeling the sharp bite of snow as I dropped to my knees to take cover. There was no time to grieve, no time for anything but survival. Each second stretched and warped, time itself bending under the weight of the moment, each heartbeat a countdown in this deadly game. Finally, we reached the Soviets' flanking line, close enough to see the panic etched into their faces as they realized their retreat was cut off. One soldier threw down his weapon, hands raised in a desperate plea, his voice trembling in words I couldn't understand. For a brief moment we locked eyes, him, the enemy, and me, his executioner. There was a raw fear there, something that reached beyond borders, beyond uniform. But my rifle was already raised, finger already on the trigger. The shot was automatic, almost reflexive. He crumpled, and the look in his eyes was gone, replaced by the hollow stare of the dead. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold, something deep inside me recoiling, even as my mind steadied itself. This was war, I reminded myself. There could be no room for pity. The last of the Soviets had fallen, their bodies strewn across the snow, their dark coats stark against the white. The silence returned, thick and heavy, settling over the forest like a shroud. I could feel it again, the eerie, suffocating stillness pressing down on us, as if the land itself was absorbing the violence, swallowing it whole. Juho stood beside me, breathing hard, his rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. He looked down at the fallen soldiers, his eyes distant, as though he were seeing something far away, something beyond the trees and snow. After a moment he glanced over at me and gave a small nod, his face hard and unreadable. "First of many," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. There was a grim acceptance in his tone, a recognition that this was only the beginning, a first step on a long, dark road that none of us would emerge from unchanged. We moved back to our positions, slipping once again into the shadows, the snow already beginning to fall lightly, covering the bodies, softening the stains of blood that marred the white. The silence returned, deeper and colder than before, and as I settled back into my post, I realized that we were alone again, alone in a world that felt indifferent to the lives it had claimed. Chapter 3. Waiting for the inevitable. After that first clash, the forest had changed. Where once it felt like a strange, cold ally, a silent witness to our fight, it now felt heavy, as though the air itself were carrying the weight of the dead. The trees stood darker, their bark scratched and pocked by the remnants of our skirmish, and the ground held a subtle, sickly scent that lingered even as the snow kept falling, covering every trace in its cold, blank embrace. We waited now, hidden in our trenches, every breath clouding the air as we watched and listened for signs of another assault. Koskinen had warned us of this part, how waiting could kill a man's spirit quicker than any bullet. In the small hours of the morning, as the cold reached its fiercest grip, I felt the truth of his words clawing at the edges of my mind. We were a small unit, 24 men huddled in hollowed-out foxholes and frozen trenches, each of us facing the empty tree line, waiting. The only sounds were the slow, muted thumps of boots on snow as men shifted or paced in small circles to stay warm. It felt as if the night itself was watching us, growing colder and darker, suffocating the courage that had surged through us just hours before. Juho's beside me, silent, his breath turning to frost on his scarf. He'd stopped speaking much since that first encounter, his usual nervous banter replaced by a stony quiet that unnerved me. He leaned his head back against the frozen earth of our trench, his rifle resting across his lap, hands covered in mittens that were worn thin from the cold and the clutching. I could see the slight tremor in his fingers, though whether it was from the cold or the memories, I couldn't tell. "You think they'll come tonight?" I whispered, half hoping he wouldn't answer. Juho's eyes flickered to me, the shadows dark beneath them, If not tonight, then tomorrow, he murmured. And if not tomorrow, then the day after. They won't stop until they push us into the sea or leave us here for dead. His words hung in the air, heavy and bleak, an echo of what each of us had been thinking but hadn't dared say. We all knew the Soviets were massing to break through our thin defenses. Our forces were stretched thin, so thin that every skirmish felt like it might be our last stand. Each night we held our ground, but each night brought more whispers from scouts, more warnings of Soviet advances, of heavy artillery and tanks that would soon make our small rifles and grenades feel like toys against the coming onslaught. I tried not to think of what might happen when they finally came. We had no bunkers, no fortified walls, nothing but thin trenches dug hastily in frozen soil, and even thinner bodies huddled within them. We were relying on every small trick we knew: the cover of trees, the deep snows that muffled movement, the sharp Nordic cold that would sap a man's strength if he lingered too long in one place. These woods were our home, our fortress, but they were also a prison. There was nowhere to run. The hours dragged, and fatigue settled in, as unshakable as the cold. I began to lose track of time, my senses dulling, eyes glazing as I stared out over the edge of the trench, squinting into the dark that lay between the trees. Shadows shifted, but they could have been anything: a trick of the moonlight, a gust of wind, or, worst of all, my own mind playing cruel games. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus. Sleep tried to claim me, creeping into the edges of my vision like a thief, but I fought it, knowing that sleep here could be a death sentence. More than one man had been found frozen in his post, rifle still gripped in stiff, lifeless hands. That fear alone kept me awake, eyes fixed on the tree line, scanning for movement in the dense shadows. When dawn finally broke, it was slow and pale, more a dim glow than true daylight, yet it felt like a lifeline, a reminder that we were still alive, still fighting. The weak light bled across the snow, revealing more of the desolation around us, broken branches and disturbed drifts bearing witness to the night's tension. It felt like an uneasy truce had settled between us and the enemy, both sides waiting, both sides knowing that sooner or later, one of us would have to break it. Koskinen came by, his face drawn and tired, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he spoke in a low voice. "Get what rest you can today. They'll come again soon, but no telling when." His eyes met mine, a flicker of something fierce and weary passing between us. I nodded, swallowing hard against the tension that had settled in my chest. Later that morning, Juho and I took turns napping in our trench, but even in sleep I felt no peace. I dreamt of Kokkola, of warm bread and the smell of pine, of the cold sea breeze, of faces I hadn't seen in months. They were shadows, half-forgotten memories that seemed strange and distant here in this endless winter. When I woke, it was to the same silence, the same waiting. That afternoon, one of our scouts returned. His face was white, eyes darting to the edges of the forest as he spoke in a low, urgent tone to Koskinen. I caught fragments of his words: columns moving, tanks, artillery. My heart sank. The Soviets were preparing for a full assault, a massive wave that would bear down on our positions and either sweep us away or bury us where we stood. It was no longer a question of if they would come, but when. The men gathered that night, grim-faced as Koskinen relayed the scouts' report. His words were simple, practical, meant to focus us. "They'll hit us hard, but we're here to hold them back. Every man they lose here is one less they can send against our brothers down south. Make every shot count. Make them feel every inch of snow they try to take from us." There was a tight silence after he finished speaking, each man's face set in cold determination. It was the kind of speech that didn't inspire victory but resolved the understanding that, whatever happened, we were all in this together, bound by the knowledge that we would either hold the line, or we would die trying. Juho looked at me, his face set, eyes fierce despite the exhaustion etched into every line. "We'll make them pay for every step," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, a vow meant for only the two of us. I nodded, feeling that same fierce resolve rise within me, swallowing the fear and despair that lingered just beneath. We returned to our posts, each of us settling into the long, agonizing wait, our eyes fixed on the darkening tree line. The hours crawled by, each heartbeat a steady drum in the quiet night. Every so often I caught myself listening for sounds: footsteps, the grind of metal on ice, the murmur of voices, anything that would signal the approach of the enemy. But there was only the sound of our own breathing, the occasional crunch of boots in the snow as someone shifted, the soft hum of silence blanketing the forest. It was in that silence that I felt the weight of our task pressing down on me. We were here to hold the line, to make sure the Soviets couldn't push through to the heart of our country, to protect our homes, our families, the lives we had left behind. The thought gave me strength, a thread of warmth that steadied my hand as I gripped my rifle, watching, waiting. It was a heavy burden, but one I would carry gladly. As night deepened, the silence grew colder, sharper, a quiet filled with dread and inevitability. I knew that, come morning, the snow would be marked by the footprints of those who sought to claim this land, stained by the blood of those who would fight to defend it. We would stand firm, bracing against the storm that was coming, and as I looked out over the snowy forest, I felt something settle within me, a fierce and unbreakable resolve. The Soviets would come, and we would be ready. Chapter 4. Cold as the enemy. The days that followed were a blur of frost, fear, and fatigue. Our trench had become more than just a line of defense, it was our world, a thin, frozen vein winding through the forest, with nothing but a few feet of snow and dirt shielding us from the chaos waiting to break loose. And while the threat of the Soviets loomed constant, it was the cold that had become our truest enemy, sneaking in as insidiously as death itself. Each breath we took filled our lungs with icy daggers, every movement sending small shivers that burrowed deep into the bone. The snow, indifferent and endless, seemed determined to bury us beneath its weight. There was a silence to these winter days that filled me with a strange unease. It was the kind of silence that turned thoughts into haunting whispers. I found myself thinking of home, of Kokkola, the warm fire in our family's old stone house, the familiar creak of floorboards underfoot, the scent of rye bread and pine in the air. But each memory, once so vivid, seemed now like a ghost, pale and fading, harder to reach with every day. I couldn't hold on to them, and that loss of memory, of warmth, seemed as bitter as the cold that clawed at me. Juho, who had always been quick with a joke or a story, had grown quiet as well, his face taking on the color and texture of the winter itself, hard, gray, almost hollow. His eyes, once bright with that fierce glint, were now rimmed with dark circles, his gaze fixed often on some distant point just beyond the trench's edge. He would go hours without speaking, his breath coming in shallow clouds, his mind a fortress as silent and unyielding as the snow itself. "What you thinking about, Juho?" I asked him one evening, hoping to pull him from that frozen silence. Juho turned to me, his gaze slow, unfocused, as if he had to drag himself back from wherever he'd been. He hesitated, then shrugged, rubbing his hands together in a futile attempt at warmth. "Mostly I think about how the cold eats away at everything," he muttered. "The body, the mind, even memories. Like nothing can last out here. Not us, not them." He gestured vaguely toward the tree line where the Soviets lay waiting. His words sat heavy in the air, sinking into the quiet. He wasn't wrong. The cold had an almost sentient quality, as though it were watching us, testing us, waiting to see who would yield first. The rifles and rations kept us alive, but barely. Food was never warm enough to chase away the chill, and water, drawn from melted snow, had a strange, metallic taste that I couldn't shake. Even sleep had turned against us. It was dangerous to let ourselves slip too deeply, knowing that we might not wake if we gave in to its deceptive warmth. One night, as I tried to sleep in the trench, I felt my toes go numb, a painful tingling spreading up my legs and hands. I sat up, stamping my feet against the frozen ground, rubbing my hands together, trying to will the blood to flow back through my veins. I knew I wasn't the only one suffering like this. Men around me were frostbitten, some with fingers blackened, their faces cracked and chapped from the brutal wind. One of the younger soldiers, Ilmari, a boy not even 20, had a dark bruise on his cheek from where the cold had set in too deeply, the skin stiff and purple, as though he were already dead in parts. I would look at my fingers, flex them, rubbing them through the mittens Juho had patched for me from the remnants of his scarf, but even that felt like a battle. My hands ached, every small motion a reminder of how the cold worked its way through flesh and bone, unyielding, relentless. And yet, despite all this, we stayed. It was a stubborn, grim resolve, but it was ours. Each man seemed determined to hold out longer than the frost, as if we could somehow win this silent, invisible war against winter itself. The nights were the worst. Beneath a sky that stretched wide and black, with stars cold and distant, we huddled together, pressing close to share any warmth we could. In the silence, the sound of our shivering echoed softly, a rhythm to our shared suffering. When the wind picked up, slicing through our thin clothing, it felt as if the night itself were trying to push us from our posts, testing our endurance. The others wrapped themselves in their coats, scarves pulled tightly around their faces, huddling into themselves like they were retreating into whatever warmth their bodies had left. There were times when the snow would fall in thick, heavy flakes, coating the world around us in a dense, muffling layer. For a while it would seem almost peaceful, even beautiful. But then, as quickly as it fell, the snow would harden into ice, a solid barrier encasing us, sealing us in this endless, bitter fight. It was as if nature itself were conspiring with the enemy, closing in around us, reminding us of our smallness, our fragility. Then came the frostbite, stealing fingers and toes as quietly as the night. Koskinen had pulled one man from the line last night, fingers frozen stiff, skin blackened beyond saving. The doctor said they would have to come off his fingers, and the man's hollow eyes hadn't even flinched. He merely nodded, resigned, as if the loss were inevitable, a small sacrifice to this relentless winter. He had already accepted that pieces of himself would be left here, buried under snow, sacrifices to a land that seemed intent on devouring us whole. Despite the cold, despite the hunger, despite the mounting dread that one morning we might wake to the roar of Soviet tanks breaking through our line, we waited. There was a kind of defiance in it, a refusal to let this winter, this enemy, this forsaken place take what little humanity we had left. Even in the bleakest moments, that defiance stirred, fierce and unyielding. One evening, as I looked out over the trench's edge, I saw the first faint signs of dawn breaking over the horizon, a thin, pink line against the bruised sky. It was a small thing, barely more than a whisper of light, but it was enough to remind me of what lay beyond this frozen world, the world I was fighting to protect, to return to. Kokkola, with its pine forests and the sea stretching out cold but alive against the shore. It seemed so far away, that warm life. But it was there, a part of me, something the cold couldn't take. Juho saw me looking and gave a small, weary smile. He clapped a hand on my shoulder, a faint gesture, but one that felt as solid as steel. "We'll get through this," he murmured, his voice low, barely audible. "The cold won't be the end of us." And in that moment, with the weight of the night around us, I believed him. The cold was our enemy, silent and cruel, yes. It took without mercy, leaving us worn down to the bone. But it could not take the last flicker of will inside us. For all its brutality, it could not kill our memories, our resolve, the strength that kept us standing even when the world tried to swallow us whole. As the first rays of dawn stretched over the trees, I felt a small surge of warmth, a reminder that we were more than this suffering, that we could endure. The cold was relentless, yes, but so were we. Chapter 5. Soviet Firepower. The morning began like any other, with the same gray light creeping through the trees, sapping color from the world, and the same biting cold that gnawed at our fingers and toes, reminding us of our own frailty. The forest was thick with silence, that heavy, unnatural quiet that had settled over us like a shroud. It made each of us tense, our nerves stretched thin as wires, waiting for the snap. But then, just as dawn settled over the snow-draped landscape, the silence broke. First came a low rumble, distant but unmistakable, like thunder trapped underground. We froze, our ears straining to catch the source of the noise. A pulse of dread swept through us, thicker than the winter air. The sound grew, rising from a faint whisper to a bone-shaking roar, and we knew the Soviets were coming. And this time they weren't hiding in the shadows. This time they brought their might, their artillery, their tanks, rolling in with a brutal, undeniable force. Positions. Koskinen's shout cut through the stillness, snapping us back to life. Every man in the trench lurched into motion, scrambling into position, clutching rifles, adjusting sights, hands shaking not from the cold but from raw, unfiltered fear. The trench became a hive of movement, a flurry of breathless tension as we readied ourselves for the onslaught. The rumble grew, swelling to a terrible crescendo as the first tanks came into view, their gray, hulking forms moving like beasts across the snowy landscape, chewing through snow and ice. My blood ran cold as I watched, the sheer scale of their machinery dwarfing us, a chilling reminder of the Soviets' brute strength. These weren't like the small skirmish units we had encountered before. No, this was a wave of metal and fire, bearing down on us with merciless precision. The first shell hit with a deafening explosion, sending up a geyser of snow and earth. I felt the ground shudder beneath me, the shockwave tearing through the trench, rattling my teeth. It was like a thunderclap, a savage jolt that cut straight to the core. Men threw themselves flat, pressing close to the frozen earth as more shells rained down, each one a roar, a hammer of noise and fury that drowned out everything else. Juho was beside me, his face pale, his eyes wide as he clutched his rifle, staring at the advancing tanks. "We're like ants to them," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the barrage. "They'll crush us without a second thought." "Keep your head down," I told him, though I felt the same chill, the same sick twist of fear coiling in my stomach. But even as I spoke, even as the shells tore into our lines, I knew that we couldn't afford to break, couldn't afford to give in to the panic clawing at our throats. The Soviet artillery continued its relentless barrage, hammering our positions with a force that felt almost supernatural in its ferocity. Each explosion tore through the air, the impact sending up waves of snow and frozen soil, leaving smoking craters where our trench line had once been. Men shouted, their voices drowned by the thunder of shellfire. Some screamed, their cries of pain cut short as debris rained down, mingling with the snow, staining it dark and wet. Koskinen moved between us, shouting orders, his face set, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Hold the line," he yelled. "They're trying to break us, don't let them." We clung to his words like a lifeline, a reminder that we were more than just bodies huddled in the dirt, that we had a purpose, a reason to stand. I forced myself to breathe, to focus, to steady my shaking hands. This was no time to let fear rule me. "They're coming. Open fire." Koskinen's voice was raw with urgency, and I raised my rifle, sighting along the barrel, my heart hammering as I squeezed the trigger. The recoil jolted through me, grounding me, pulling me back into the fight. I saw a Soviet soldier stumble, fall, and I forced myself not to look away, not to think of what I'd just done. There was no time for regret here. And then, through the haze of smoke and snow, I saw the Soviet infantry advancing, their dark forms emerging from the tree line, moving in a loose formation, rifles at the ready. They moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency, as if they had done this 100 times, 1,000 times. And maybe they had. These weren't green soldiers, these were men trained to kill, hardened by battles we couldn't imagine. My breath caught as the first shots rang out, cutting through the air with brutal precision. They moved with a relentless, methodical pace, advancing in the wake of their own artillery, stepping over the craters, the bodies, the shattered remnants of our defenses, as if we were nothing more than obstacles in their path. All around me, my comrades were firing, the sharp crack of rifles mingling with the roar of artillery, the clash of iron and flesh. The Soviets kept humming, relentless, their faces set in grim determination. I could see them more clearly now, their pale faces, their eyes cold and empty, trained on us with a single-minded purpose. I fired again, the sound of my rifle blending into the symphony of war around me. Juho was beside me, firing with a desperation I had never seen before. His eyes narrowed, his mouth set in a thin, grim line. He muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't catch, but I could see the resolve in his face, the fierce determination that kept him standing, that kept him fighting even as the Soviet tide closed in around us. The air was thick with smoke and gunpowder, the scent sharp and metallic, mingling with the bitter cold. Each breath burned, every shot reverberated through my bones, but I forced myself to keep going, to keep fighting. The Soviets were close now, close enough that I could see the details of their uniforms, the frost clinging to their coats, the dark gleam of their weapons. They were men, flesh and blood, just like us, but they were also machines, moving forward with a terrible, unbreakable momentum. And then, a Soviet soldier broke through the line, leaping into our trench, his rifle raised. I saw the glint of his bayonet, the flash of his eyes, and I raised my own rifle, barely in time to block the thrust. The impact jarred my arms, the bayonet's edge grazing my cheek, a hot line of pain slicing across my skin. I gritted my teeth, twisting my rifle, shoving him back with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. He stumbled, and in that brief second, I brought my rifle up, pressing the barrel to his chest, pulling the trigger. The sound was deafening, the recoil slamming into me, and he fell, his body crumpling into the snow, blood staining the white in a harsh, brutal contrast. I stared at him, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the realization of what I'd done sinking in, cold and sharp. But there was no time to dwell on it. More Soviets were coming, spilling into the trench, their faces set, their eyes devoid of mercy. I fought, each movement fueled by raw survival, by the instinct to keep going, to stay alive. Around me, my comrades did the same, their shouts mingling with the screams, the gunfire, the relentless, terrible noise of war. The fight seemed endless, a blur of violence and fear, each second stretching into eternity. I lost track of time, of place, my world narrowing to the cold steel of my rifle, the faces of the men before me, the stark realization that this was a battle we might not survive. But through it all, one thing remained clear: no matter how many of them came, no matter how strong they were, we would hold. We would fight, tooth and nail, with every ounce of strength we had, until there was nothing left. We were Finnish soldiers defending our land, our home, and we would not give in. Not to the Soviets, not to the tanks, not to the fire and fury that surrounded us. And as the last Soviet soldier fell, as the noise faded, leaving only the silence and the smoke hanging heavy in the air, I realized that we had won. For now. But the battle had taken its toll, each of us bearing the scars, the weight of what we'd endured. We were alive, yes, but we had faced the Soviet firepower, and in that fire we had been changed, marked in ways that no snow, no cold could ever erase. Chapter 6. The Weight of Loss. The silence that followed the battle was a hollow one, filled with an almost deafening absence. The roar of artillery, the shouts, the gunfire, it had all faded, leaving only the rasping breaths of the survivors and the faint crackling of burnt wood from shattered trees. In that moment, the battlefield felt like a sacred, cursed ground, strewn with the bodies of men who had once been comrades, enemies, strangers. I couldn't bring myself to look too closely at any one face, lest I recognize the blank eyes of someone I had once laughed with, once called a friend. I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, as heavy as the winter sky above. Each life lost seemed to hang in the frigid air, lingering like the smoke from our rifles, dissipating slowly, achingly. And yet, the dead said nothing. They lay in the snow, silent witnesses to the madness we'd all endured, to the price we were paying for every inch of frozen soil. The air was thick with the scent of blood and gunpowder, mingling with the crisp bite of snow. I forced myself to breathe, to take in the frigid air that stung my lungs, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge of that nameless dread that hovered at the fringes of my mind. Each breath was a reminder that I was still here, still alive, though I couldn't quite understand why or how. Juho was beside me, his face a mask of exhaustion, streaked with grime and blood, whether it was his own or another's. I couldn't tell. His eyes were hollow, dark with something I couldn't put words to. The usual glint of mischief, that rebellious spark, was gone. He was staring into the middle distance, his shoulders slumped under a weight that seemed heavier than anything he could carry. "We survived," I whispered, more to myself than to him, the words hollow, almost meaningless in the wake of the carnage. Juho's gaze drifted over to me, and he gave a small, bitter smile. "Survived, sure. But what's left of us, really?" His words hit like a punch, driving the reality of it all straight into my chest. We were alive, yes, but survival had become a word emptied of comfort, of anything resembling victory. We had survived, but it was survival stripped of meaning, leaving only the cold and the gnawing ache of loss. Around us, others were moving through the battlefield, eyes downcast, searching for any signs of life among the fallen. Each man wore the same look of grim resignation, the same haunted gaze, as if we had all aged a decade in the span of a day. I could feel the weight of their sorrow mingling with my own, pressing down on me, a silent bond formed in blood and loss. As I moved through the scattered bodies, I saw Koskinen kneeling over one of the fallen, his broad frame hunched, his shoulders shaking. I'd never seen him like this before, this man who had been as solid as a rock, unbreakable, the one who held us together with sheer willpower. His hand rested on the chest of a young soldier, one I recognized with a pang of pain as Ilmari, the boy with the frostbitten cheek, whose laughter had once brightened even the darkest nights. "He was so young," Koskinen whispered, his voice choked, almost unrecognizable. He didn't look up, his eyes fixed on Ilmari's pale face, his hand still resting on the boy's chest, as if he were trying to keep the life within him from slipping away. I placed a hand on Koskinen's shoulder, offering what little comfort I could. "We'll remember him," I said, though the words felt feeble, empty against the enormity of what we had lost. "We'll remember them all." Koskinen nodded, his face hardening as he rose, wiping a hand across his face. He turned to the men, his voice steady once more, though the sadness lingered in his eyes. "We have to move on," he said, his voice a low murmur that carried through the silence. "We'll bury them, mark their resting places. They deserve that much." One by one, we began the grim task of laying our dead to rest. It felt wrong, almost sacrilegious, to disturb their stillness, to cover them in snow. But we did it anyway, our hands numb, our hearts heavy. We whispered their names as we worked, a soft litany that felt like a prayer, a way of keeping them with us, even as we left them behind. When we came to Juho's younger brother, Lori, the weight of the loss hit me like a hammer blow. Juho knelt by his brother's side, his hands trembling as he adjusted Lori's collar, brushing snow from his face. He stayed there, silent, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on Lori's peaceful expression. "He didn't even see it coming," Juho murmured, his voice breaking, raw with grief. One second he was laughing, and the next, he trailed off, his fingers tightening around Lori's collar, as if he could somehow bring him back through sheer will alone. I knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through him, the grief he tried so hard to contain. There was nothing I could say that would ease his pain, nothing that could bring his brother back. All I could do was stand by him, share his sorrow in the only way I knew how. After a while, Juho rose, his face pale but set, his gaze distant. He looked out over the battlefield, his jaw clenched, a flicker of something fierce and unyielding in his eyes. "They took everything from us," he muttered, his voice low, steady, cold as the snow beneath our feet. "But they can't take what's left. Not while we're still standing." I nodded, feeling the same hard resolve settle in my chest, a fragile strength born from the ashes of what we had lost. We were broken, yes, fractured by the weight of grief and loss, but we were still here, still breathing. And that, somehow, was enough. As we finished laying the last of our comrades to rest, a sense of finality washed over me, heavy and somber. I looked out over the snow-covered graves, each one a silent testament to the price we had paid. I didn't know if I could carry that weight forever, if I could hold on to their memories without being crushed beneath them. But for now, I would hold it. I would carry it, because that was all I could do. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, tinting the snow with a faint, red glow. It was a stark, eerie beauty, a reminder of the life that continued even as we stood among the dead. And in that moment, I felt a strange, fierce determination surge within me, a spark of defiance against the darkness that had taken so much from us. Chapter 7. Frozen to the bone. The chill had seeped deep into my bones, settling in like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Cold. It was no longer just a sensation. It was a constant, a force as familiar as the breath in my lungs, as persistent as my own heartbeat. Each step we took through the frozen forest drove the cold deeper, making it harder to remember what warmth felt like, or if it had ever existed at all. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we moved, a sound that grew louder in the silence, each step a reminder of how exposed we were out here. It was one of those rare, bitter days where the cold seemed to bite harder than usual, gnawing at us even through layers of wool and leather. My gloves were stiff with ice, my fingers numb, almost useless as I gripped my rifle, each joint aching with every movement. The frost clung to our eyebrows, eyelashes, even to the faintest stubble on our faces, turning us into figures cut from ice. It had been days since the last attack, and the waiting was beginning to wear on us, fraying our nerves, sapping our strength in a way no battle ever could. At least in the heat of combat, there was an adrenaline to draw on, a raw urgency that forced you to act, to survive. But here, in the cold, in the silence, it was like standing on the edge of something vast and empty, staring into an abyss that had no end. Koskinen, our sergeant, moved up and down the line, his face set in that familiar stoic mask. But I could see the way his shoulders sagged, the exhaustion that had settled into his every movement. He was tired, just as we all were, but he wouldn't show it. He couldn't. We needed him to be our anchor, the one constant in a world that had been turned upside down. "Keep moving," he muttered as he passed, his breath a faint mist in the air, his words clipped and direct. "The cold's worse when you stand still." Juho let out a dry laugh, his voice rough and cracked. And here I thought my toes had already frozen off. He flexed his fingers, trying to warm them, his expression caught between resignation and dark humor. "I swear, I can't feel half my limbs anymore." I grunted in agreement, though I knew that complaining wouldn't help. It wouldn't bring back the warmth, wouldn't make the frostbite any less real. The frostbite, the silent enemy we couldn't fight, couldn't shoot at or evade. It crept in during the long hours of standing watch, slipped into the cracks of our boots, burrowed under our coats and scarves, and made its home within us. Night was falling, and with it came an even more brutal cold. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in shadow, the trees stretching tall and dark against the sky, like specters. The temperature dropped, turning the very air into something solid, something sharp. Every breath felt like swallowing ice. I could see the fatigue settling in on the faces of my comrades, the lines of worry etched into their features, the shivers they tried and failed to hide. We were a frozen band of men, a handful of survivors clinging to life in a land that seemed determined to take it from us. We found a small grove of trees to make camp, huddling close, sharing what little warmth we could. Our hands shook as we unrolled our packs, fingers fumbling with the ties, too numb to be precise. Koskinen barked out orders, his voice a steady rhythm in the darkness, guiding us as we gathered whatever dry wood we could find. It wasn't much, just a handful of brittle branches and scraps, but it would have to do. After some struggle, Juho managed to spark a fire, the small flame flickering, dancing in the dark, casting shadows over our faces. We all moved closer, leaning in, hands outstretched toward the warmth, our breaths clouding the air. The fire was small, barely enough to keep the frost at bay, but we sat around it as if it were a hearth in a warm house, the centerpiece of some other life, a life where warmth was plentiful and fire was not a matter of survival. For a moment we sat in silence, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts, our own memories. I could almost imagine myself back home, in Kokkola, sitting by the fire, my family gathered around, laughter filling the room. The memory was sharp, painful in its clarity, a reminder of everything I'd left behind, everything I was fighting for. But the warmth of that memory faded quickly, swallowed by the cold reality around me. Juho broke the silence, his voice soft, almost wistful. "Do you think we'll ever feel warm again?" I glanced at him, seeing the same question in his eyes, the same yearning for something more than this endless cold. I wanted to say yes, to offer him that comfort, but the words caught in my throat, strangled by doubt. How could I promise something I wasn't sure of myself? Koskinen spoke up, his tone matter-of-fact, unyielding. "We'll feel warm when this war's over, when we've sent them back across the border. Until then, we endure." The firelight caught on his face, casting harsh shadows, making him look older, warier than I had ever seen him. But there was something in his eyes, a hardness, a determination that defied the cold, that refused to bow to the winter. It was a reminder, a small spark of hope that, for all the chill in our bones, there was still warmth within us, a fire that the cold couldn't touch. We huddled closer, drawing what little comfort we could from each other, from the small flickering flame. And as the night wore on, as the fire burned low, we shared stories, memories of home, of loved ones waiting for us, of summers past. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of holding on to something human in the face of an inhuman cold. Hours passed, the fire slowly dying, the cold creeping in once more. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the numbness settling over me again, the ache in my joints, the sting of frostbite on my fingers and toes. But I kept my eyes on the last glowing embers, refusing to let them fade from my sight. Eventually, Koskinen told us to sleep, though we knew that rest would be fleeting, that the cold would wake us before long. We settled into uneasy positions, each of us cocooned in layers, clutching our rifles, our bodies pressed close to conserve warmth. The night was long, and the cold gnawed at us, a relentless, merciless enemy. I drifted in and out of sleep, caught between dreams and wakefulness, my mind a haze of cold and exhaustion. In the moments when I managed to slip away, I dreamed of warmth, of home, of a life where frost wasn't an enemy, where fire was a friend, not a fleeting, fragile thing. But each time I woke, I was pulled back into the reality of our frozen camp, the cold pressing down on me, heavy as iron, grounding me in this bitter, unyielding winter. I could see the others shivering, their breaths clouding the air, their faces drawn, pale, marked by the toll the cold had taken. As dawn broke, the light weak and gray, we rose, stiff and weary, our movements slow, our faces numb. The fire was gone, reduced to a faint patch of warmth in the snow, a memory of the night before. But we were still standing, still breathing, and that was something. It was enough, for now. Koskinen gathered us together, his voice low but steady. "We keep moving," he said, his words a quiet resolve that cut through the cold. "We keep going. For them. For us." I nodded, clutching my rifle, feeling the familiar weight in my hands, a reminder of our purpose, of the reason we endured this cold. We moved out, leaving the remnants of our camp behind, each step a fight against the numbness, the exhaustion, the unrelenting chill that threatened to consume us. And as we trudged through the snow, I clung to that small spark within me, that defiance against the winter, the cold. It was a fragile thing, a flickering flame, but it was mine, and I would not let it go. We were frozen to the bone, each of us marked by the cold, by the weight of this endless winter. But we kept going, each step a testament to our resolve, to the fire that still burned within us, faint but unbroken. And as the wind howled around us, as the snow fell in heavy drifts, I knew that we would survive, that we would endure, because that was all we had left, the will to keep moving, to keep fighting, even in the face of a winter that sought to take everything from us. Chapter 8. Defiance in the Face of Doom. The blizzard had set in overnight, thick and punishing, as if the very skies had conspired to bury us. Snow whipped around in furious swirls, cutting visibility to a few yards, an unending torrent of white and gray that blurred the line between earth and sky. The trees stood like dark sentinels, half shrouded in snow, looming in and out of sight like wraiths. Every step was a battle, every movement an act of defiance against a world that seemed hell-bent on wiping us from its surface. By now, the cold was a living thing within us, a force we carried like a hidden weapon and a hidden curse. Our faces were wind-burned, raw beneath our scarves and woolen caps. Even with every layer we could muster, we felt the cold knifing through. But we were Finnish soldiers, born into the snow and tempered in ice, and even if the cold was unrelenting, we would not be the first to flinch. Koskinen led us, his broad back stooped under the weight of exhaustion, though his pace never faltered. His breath was steady, purposeful, visible even through the blinding white of the storm. He didn't need to say much, his presence alone anchoring us as we pushed forward through the snow, the distant echo of artillery somewhere behind us a constant reminder of our plight. The Soviets weren't far, perhaps closer than we thought, though they'd be suffering under this storm just as we were. But unlike us, they were strangers to this icebound land, and their resolve didn't run as deep. I held to that thought, to that small, fiery truth. Hours passed, the sun a pale smudge above us, barely able to pierce the thick clouds that choked the sky. We were tired, drained, and freezing, but as we moved, a sense of unity bound us tighter. The silence between us was a pact, an understanding that whatever happened, we would see this through to the bitter end. Juho trudged beside me, his face obscured by a scarf, only his eyes visible, bloodshot and intense. He nudged me, leaning close to be heard over the shrieking wind. "Reckon they're out there?" he asked, his voice muffled. I glanced around, squinting against the snow. "They'll be out there somewhere," I said, though in truth I wasn't sure. But even if we were to find ourselves in the middle of Soviet forces, trapped or surrounded, we'd face it with whatever strength we could muster. That was the spirit we carried. No matter the odds, we would stand defiant. Finally, we found a slight break in the storm, an old abandoned farmhouse half buried in snow, its roof bowed with the weight of ice. It was little more than a hovel, but to us it was a sanctuary, a momentary refuge from the fury of the elements. We stumbled inside, shaking the snow from our clothes, stamping our boots, the thin warmth of the enclosed space a balm against the relentless cold. Koskinen lowered himself onto an overturned crate, his face drawn but resolute. The fire in his eyes had not dulled, and he looked at each of us as if daring us to quit, daring us to show weakness. Juho threw himself onto the floor beside him, stretching out with a tired groan, his hands fumbling for his rations. I settled against the wall, pulling off my gloves and rubbing my fingers to bring life back into them. My hands shook, my joints stiff, though I forced myself to ignore the numbing pain, the slow crawl of frostbite that I knew was taking root. Koskinen's voice cut through the weary silence. "We'll hold here until the storm lets up. Keep your weapons close and stay sharp." Juho scoffed, though a grin pulled at his mouth. "They'd be mad to come out in this," he muttered, tearing a piece of frozen bread with his teeth. "Even the Soviets wouldn't dare." Koskinen's gaze narrowed. "And that's why they'll come. Because they think they can catch us off guard, waiting out the storm." Juho's grin faded, and we all fell silent, the weight of Koskinen's words settling heavily among us. The truth was, the Soviets would seize any advantage they could, and we were tired, bone-tired, frostbitten, and clinging to what little strength we had left. But the thought of giving in, of succumbing to that exhaustion, only stirred something stronger within me, a defiance that burned hot against the bitter cold. After a time, the storm eased, the howling winds dying to a low, sinister moan. Outside, the world was cloaked in a pristine white silence, the snow-covered trees still and watchful. Koskinen motioned for us to follow him, his movements slow but assured, every bit the leader we needed him to be. We moved into formation, eyes scanning the blinding landscape, our breaths shallow as we braced ourselves. And then, in the stillness, I heard a distant rumble, a vibration through the ground, faint but unmistakable. The sound of Soviet tanks. Koskinen held up a hand, signaling us to take cover. My heart hammered as I pressed myself behind a tree, Juho close beside me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. We couldn't see the tanks yet, but we could hear them, the heavy growl of engines growing louder, closer. They were coming for us, rolling through the snow like iron behemoths, intent on crushing anything in their path. But fear wasn't the only thing coursing through me. There was something else, a fierce, unyielding resolve that defied the doom bearing down on us. I looked around at my comrades, saw that same defiance mirrored in their eyes. We were cold, we were exhausted, but we were not defeated. Koskinen signaled for us to fan out, to spread into the trees and ready our rifles. We moved quickly, silently, slipping through the snow like shadows. I could see the tanks now, massive shapes emerging from the blinding white, their armored hulls gleaming cold and deadly. Soldiers marched beside them, their expressions hard, their movements methodical, a machine of war come to life in the frozen landscape. And then, Koskinen gave the signal, a sharp, piercing whistle that cut through the silence like a blade. We opened fire, the sharp crack of rifles shattering the stillness, bullets ripping through the air, finding their marks with deadly precision. The Soviets scrambled, taken by surprise, some falling in the snow, their bodies left to freeze where they fell. But the tanks rolled on, relentless, their guns turning toward us, spitting fire that lit up the forest, the shells exploding around us in bursts of snow and flame. I ducked behind a tree as a shell hit nearby, the shockwave knocking me to the ground, snow filling my mouth, my vision blurred. I forced myself up, my hands shaking as I took aim again, feeling that same fire surge within me, a defiance that refused to yield. Beside me, Juho was firing steadily, his face set, his eyes fierce. He looked at me, a grim smile twisting his mouth. If we go down fighting. I nodded, feeling that same resolve harden within me. There was no retreat, no surrender. Only this moment, this stand, a testament to our will to survive, to resist. We fought on, our bullets cutting through the storm, each shot a defiance against the doom that surrounded us. The battle stretched on, each second an eternity, each breath a struggle. But as the tanks advanced, as the Soviets closed in, I felt a strange, terrible clarity. We were outnumbered, outgunned, but we were not beaten. And in that moment, as the snow fell around us, as the world seemed to narrow to the cold and the sound of gunfire, I understood something vital. We weren't just fighting for our lives, we were fighting for something far greater. For our homes, for our families, for the land that had given us life. We were fighting for the right to stand on our own soil, to call it ours. The tanks bore down, closer and closer, but we did not falter. We held our ground, our rifles aimed steady, our breaths shallow but unwavering. We were frozen to the bone, yes, but our spirits burned with a fire that no amount of snow or steel could quench. And in the face of doom, in the shadow of death itself, we did what we knew best. We stood defiant. Chapter 9. Last Stand in the Snow. Dawn was nothing but a dull glow through a slate-gray sky as we faced the line of Soviet tanks. The machines loomed like iron giants, steel-plated harbingers against a bloodless sky. They stood at the edge of the clearing, motionless for now, as if taking measure of us one last, somber pause before the inevitable clash. Snow draped over their turrets and treads, frozen symbols of relentless power, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world held its breath. Around me, our small group took position, each man a shadow in the snow. Our faces were streaked with grime and frost, our eyes hollowed from days without sleep, but we clung to our rifles with a death grip, as if sheer will alone would turn them into something powerful enough to break iron. To my left, Koskinen surveyed the enemy line, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought it might snap. His eyes had a different look about them this morning, no longer fierce but tempered, resolved. He knew what this would be. We all did, and still, no one flinched. "Any man who wants to go back, now's your chance," Koskinen said, his voice low but steady. He glanced at each of us, his gaze lingering for a heartbeat longer on Juho, who returned the stare with an unwavering grin. Juho chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't come all this way to die in my bed." He adjusted his scarf and spat into the snow, squaring his shoulders against the cold. The others stayed silent, but I saw it in their eyes, the same refusal to turn away, the same stubborn pride. It was more than pride, I realized. It was a fierce, binding love for this land, this frigid, unyielding country that had forged us in its crucible of ice and snow. We weren't just soldiers. We were a part of Finland bound to her by blood and frost, as unbreakable as the bedrock beneath us. Koskinen's gaze softened for a brief moment, and he nodded. "Then let's make them remember," he said. "If we fall today, they'll remember this place, and they'll remember the cost." He raised his rifle, the signal to take our positions. We moved into the snow, the crunch of it beneath our boots the only sound in the thick silence. My fingers were numb as I gripped my rifle, and I rubbed them against my chest, forcing feeling back into them. I knew I would need every last bit of strength I had left. As we readied ourselves, a low rumble filled the air, growing louder, more menacing. The Soviets' engines roared to life, the ground vibrating beneath our feet as they began their advance. The tanks rolled forward in a steady, unstoppable march, their treads grinding through the snow, flattening everything in their path. Behind them, the soldiers advanced in formation, rifles gleaming coldly against the overcast sky. The ground trembled as they approached, and for a heartbeat, a shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. But I held my ground, breathing steady, the weight of my rifle familiar, comforting. Around me, my comrades steadied themselves, each face set in grim determination. Juho was muttering something under his breath, a string of words I couldn't make out, his gaze locked on the advancing enemy with a dark gleam in his eyes. Whatever fear we felt was swallowed by something larger, something fiercer. We were not going to give them an inch of this ground. Not 1 inch. "Hold," Koskinen called softly, his voice steady. We waited, breath clouding the air, fingers tense on triggers. The Soviets drew closer, their footsteps loud in the silence, the tanks moving with a relentless, grinding determination. "Hold." The tanks loomed over us now, close enough that I could see the rivets in their armor, the cold gleam of their gun barrels, aimed squarely in our direction. My heart hammered, each beat loud in my ears, but I kept my rifle trained, my gaze steady. "Hold now." Koskinen's command rang out, sharp as a gunshot. We opened fire in a blinding volley, bullets tearing through the frigid air, finding their marks with deadly precision. Soldiers fell in the snow, the bright stain of blood a stark contrast against the white. But the tanks rolled on, undeterred, their guns swinging toward us as their crews scrambled to return fire. Shells exploded around us, ripping through the trees, sending splinters and chunks of ice flying. Snow sprayed up in great plumes, filling the air with a blinding white haze. I ducked as a shell hit close, the shockwave knocking me off my feet, my vision blurring. My ears rang, a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else, but I forced myself up, gripping my rifle with numb hands. Through the haze, I saw Koskinen shouting orders, his face calm, his eyes blazing with fierce intensity. He pointed toward a tank on the left flank, and I understood immediately. With Juho and a few others, I scrambled through the snow, circling around the tank, our movements swift and low. We fired in short bursts, covering each other, ducking behind trees as shells whistled past us, the Soviets trying to pin us down. But we pressed on, weaving through the snow like shadows, each step bringing us closer to the tank. Juho had managed to find a grenade, and he held it up, a fierce grin lighting his face. He tossed it with deadly accuracy, and I watched as it arsed through the air, landing squarely beneath the tank's treads. There was a blinding flash, a roar, and the tank shuddered, black smoke billowing from its undercarriage. It stalled, its gun barrel swinging uselessly, and for a moment, a cheer rose up among us. But it was short-lived. Another tank opened fire, and I heard a strangled cry behind me as one of our own went down, clutching his side, blood staining his parka. I turned, firing wildly, driven by a desperate rage. Around me, my comrades fell one by one, each man holding his ground, firing to the last. We fought like men possessed, driven by something beyond survival, beyond reason. Each shot we fired, each step we took, was an act of defiance, a refusal to let this enemy take what was ours. The snow was thick with the smoke of gunfire, the sharp smell of gunpowder filling my nostrils, mingling with the scent of pine and the cold bite of the air. It was as if the very forest had joined our fight, its trees standing tall and unyielding, the snow-covered ground bearing witness to our last stand. I fired until my rifle was empty, my fingers numb, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Around me, my comrades fought on, their movements slower, more desperate, each man battered and bleeding but refusing to fall. Juho was at my side, his face pale, his breathing labored, but he flashed me a wild grin, his eyes fierce. "This is it," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the din. "We give them hell, or we go down trying." I nodded, feeling the same fire burn within me. "To the last, Juho." We charged forward together, our movements a blur of fury and determination, a final act of defiance against the doom that loomed over us. We fought with every ounce of strength we had left, our bodies battered, our spirits unbroken. But the enemy was relentless. One by one, my comrades fell, their bodies crumpling into the snow, each man leaving a mark, a testament to his courage. Juho went down beside me, a sharp cry escaping his lips, his hand clutching my arm as he sank to his knees, his breath ragged. "Keep going," he gasped, his grip tightening for a moment before loosening, his eyes closing. "Make them remember us." I nodded, a fierce, silent promise burning in my chest. I would fight on, I would make them remember. Even if this was the end, even if I were to fall here in the snow, I would leave my mark. I raised my rifle one last time, my body trembling with exhaustion, my vision blurred. The last of the Soviet soldiers loomed before me, their faces hard, their guns aimed. But I stood tall, unyielding, my heart steady. And as the snow fell around us, as the world narrowed to this final, silent moment, I felt a strange peace settle over me. We had stood our ground, we had fought to the last, and in that, there was a victory they could never take from us. The cold bit into me, deeper than ever, but I felt a warmth, a pride that no winter could quench. And as the world went silent, as the snow covered us like a final, solemn shroud, I knew that we would be remembered. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more tales of courage and resilience. Until next time.